It is the longest day of the year. Sunday, June 22, 1941. A long frontier stretching 1,800 miles from the cold mists of the Baltic Sea in the north to the Danube Delta in the Black Sea in the south. A heavy, unnatural silence hangs over the earth. On the western bank of the Bug River, millions of men wait in the darkness. They are concealed in forests, huddled in forward trenches, and strapped into the cramped steel hulls of 3,000 tanks. They check their watches. They wait for the signal. At exactly 3:15 hours, the sky tears open. The horizon ignites with the muzzle flashes of 7,000 German artillery pieces. A wall of sound rolls eastward, shattering the pre-dawn stillness, followed instantly by the scream of mortar, shells, and the thunder of heavy howitzers. This is not merely an attack. It is a cataclysm. In the first 60 seconds, communication lines are severed, bridges are targeted, and forward Soviet outposts are vaporized. As the smoke begins to drift across the river, the rumble of diesel engines joins the cacophony. The Wehrmacht, fresh from its conquests in France and the Balkans, begins to move. 3 massive army groups, comprising over 3 million soldiers, 1 million horses, and 600,000 vehicles, surge forward. Operation Barbarossa has begun. It is the largest military invasion in the history of warfare, a collision of titans that will dictate the fate of the 20th century. To understand the sheer magnitude of this moment, we must understand the hubris behind it. 6 months prior, Adolf Hitler had issued Führer Directive 21. He told his generals, when Operation Barbarossa commences, the world will hold its breath and make no comment. This was to be the culmination of National Socialist ideology, the acquisition of Lebensraum, or living space, in the East, and the total annihilation of what Hitler termed Judeo-Bolshevism. This was not designed to be a conventional war for territory. It was designed, from the very first stroke of the pen, as a war of extermination. On the other side of the river, the Soviet Union is paralyzed. Despite months of intelligence warnings from British spies, German defectors, and his own agents, Joseph Stalin has refused to believe that Hitler would break the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact so soon. The Red Army is massive, possessing more tanks and aircraft than the Germans, but it is a giant with clay feet. Its officer corps has been decapitated by Stalin's Great Purge of the late 1930s. Experienced commanders have been executed or imprisoned, replaced by political loyalists who are terrified of independent decision-making. As the German artillery lifts its barrage to targets further inland, the chaos within the Red Army is absolute. Frontline units radio Moscow desperately. "We are being fired upon. What shall we do?" The response from the Kremlin is fatal. "Do not yield to provocations." Stalin believes this is merely a rogue action by undisciplined German generals, not an invasion. By the time the Soviet High Command realizes the truth, the German spearheads are already miles deep into Soviet territory. The strategic plan of the invasion relies on 3 gigantic thrusts. In the north, Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb commands Army Group North. His objective is the ideological birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution, Leningrad. In the south, the chaotic medley of German, Romanian, and Hungarian troops under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt targets the economic heartland, the wheat fields of Ukraine, the city of Kiev, and eventually, the oil of the Caucasus. But the most powerful blow is struck in the center. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, contains the bulk of the Wehrmacht's armored might. Here, the panzer groups of Heinz Guderian and Hermann Hoth are unleashed. Their objective is the political heart of the enemy, Moscow. The speed of the German advance in these first hours is terrifying. The Luftwaffe, operating with ruthless efficiency, executes a masterclass in tactical air superiority. Thousands of Soviet aircraft, lined up in neat rows on forward airfields, are destroyed before they can even start their engines. By noon on the first day, the Red Air Force has ceased to exist as a cohesive fighting force in the border regions. The Germans claim to have destroyed 1,200 aircraft by the end of day 1. The reality is even higher. The skies belong to the Luftwaffe, allowing Stuka dive bombers to harass Soviet columns and supply lines with impunity. On the ground, the German blitzkrieg tactics perfected in France are applied with lethal precision. The panzers do not stop to fight the infantry divisions on the border. They punch through the weak points, bypassing strongholds, and race deep into the rear. They cut supply lines, sever communications, and seize bridges. The Soviet rifle divisions, slow-moving and partially mobilized, find themselves fighting enemies in front of them, behind them, and on their flanks simultaneously. Within 48 hours, The pattern of the summer is set. The Germans create massive kettles, encirclements. Two huge armored pincers meet behind the Soviet lines, trapping entire armies inside. The first great tragedy unfolds at Białystok and Minsk. Here, nearly 500,000 Soviet soldiers are surrounded. They fight with a desperate, chaotic ferocity that shocks the Germans, who are used to the surrender of demoralized French troops. The Russians fight until their ammunition runs out, often charging tanks with Molotov cocktails or bare hands. But bravery cannot overcome a lack of leadership. The Soviet command structure collapses. General Dmitry Pavlov, commander of the Western Front, loses contact with his armies. He has no idea where the Germans are, or even where his own forces are. When he finally reports the disaster to Stalin, he pays the ultimate price. He is recalled to Moscow, accused of treason, and shot. This sends a chilling message to the remaining commanders: victory or death. Yet, amidst the German triumphs, there are subtle warning signs that this war will be different. The roads, poor unpaved tracks, turn to choking dust clouds that destroy German engines. The distances are vast, stretching supply lines to the breaking point, and the resistance, though uncoordinated, is savage. At the fortress of Brest-Litovsk, a citadel on the border meant to fall in hours, a garrison of Red Army soldiers holds out for weeks, deep behind German lines, fighting from the sewers and rubble, refusing to surrender. It is a omen. The Wehrmacht has kicked in the door, and the whole rotten structure seems to be crashing down, just as Hitler predicted. But as the panzers roll past the burning wrecks of Soviet BT-7 tanks, and the columns of dazed prisoners stretching to the horizon, they are marching into a vastness that swallows armies whole. They are winning every battle, but the war has only just begun. By early July 1941, the mood in the German High Command is bordering on euphoria. Franz Halder, the chief of the Army General Staff, writes a now infamous entry in his diary. It is not saying too much to state that the campaign against Russia has been won in 14 days. On the surface, his confidence seems justified. The Wehrmacht is tearing the map apart. In the north, the panzers are racing through the Baltic states towards Leningrad faster than their supply trucks can follow. In the center, the trap at Minsk has closed, capturing over 300,000 Soviet soldiers and 2,500 tanks. The road to Moscow seems open. But as the Germans push deeper into the Russian interior, the reality of the war begins to shift. The soldiers on the ground are noticing things that the generals looking at maps in Berlin cannot see. They are noticing the dust. It is a fine, abrasive powder that chokes engines, jams machine guns, and coats the faces of marching infantry in ghostly gray masks. They are noticing the endlessness of the horizon, and they are noticing a terrifying new weapon. Near the Berezina River, German anti-tank crews spot a new profile on the battlefield. It is a tank with sloped armor and wide tracks. They fire their standard 37mm anti-tank guns, the door knockers, but the shells simply bounce off the steel hide of the Soviet machine. This is the T-34. For the first time, German panzers face a tank superior to their own. While the T-34s lack radios and their crews are poorly trained, the mere existence of this vehicle sends a shockwave through the German ranks. It is a signal that the Soviet bear has technological claws. Simultaneously, a terrifying sound begins to haunt the German infantry. It is a screeching howl, like tearing canvas, followed by a sudden devastation of an entire grid square. The Soviets have introduced the BM-13 Katyusha rocket launchers, soon nicknamed Stalin's organs. They are inaccurate, but their psychological impact is devastating. Despite these surprises, the German war machine grinds inexorably toward the city of Smolensk. This is the historic land bridge to Moscow. If Smolensk falls quickly, the capital is next. The Battle of Smolensk, raging from mid-July into August, becomes a crucible. The Red Army, desperate to buy time for reserves to mobilize, throws itself at the invaders with suicidal fury. The encirclements continue, capturing another 300,000 Soviets. But the fighting is different now. It is slower. It is bloodier. The German infantry, marching 20 to 30 miles a day on foot to keep up with the tanks, is exhausted. The panzer divisions are running low on fuel and spare parts. The Blitzkrieg is losing its momentum to friction and attrition. It is here, in late August, that the invasion reaches its critical strategic crossroads. The path to Moscow is open, but the German flanks are exposed. To the south, in Ukraine, a massive concentration of Soviet forces, nearly 1 million men under Marshal Semyon Budyonny, sits on the flank of Army Group Center. A fierce debate erupts in the German High Command. The generals, led by Guderian and Halder, argue passionately for an immediate strike on Moscow. The head of the snake is Moscow, they argue. Take the capital, destroy the rail hub, and the regime collapses. Adolf Hitler disagrees. He looks at the map not as a soldier, but as an ideologue and an economist. He wants the agricultural wealth of Ukraine and the coal of the Donets Basin. He wants to secure the Crimea so Soviet bombers cannot reach the Romanian oil fields that fuel his war machine. He issues a fateful order. The drive on Moscow is halted. Heinz Guderian is furious. He flies to Hitler's headquarters to protest, but is overruled. The 2nd Panzer Group is ordered to turn south, away from Moscow, to link up with Army Group South and encircle Kiev. From a tactical standpoint, Hitler's decision leads to the greatest military victory in history. As Guderian's panzers drive south and Kleist's panzers drive north, they close a gigantic steel trap around Kiev. Inside the pocket are nearly 700,000 soldiers of the Soviet Southwest Front. Stalin, refusing to allow a retreat until it is too late, seals their doom. The Battle of Kiev concludes in late September with the annihilation of entire Soviet armies. Over 600,000 prisoners march into captivity, a column so long it takes days to pass a single point. It is a catastrophe for the Soviet Union that eclipses all others. The entire southern flank of the USSR has been ripped open. However, from a strategic standpoint, the victory at Kiev is a poisoned chalice. While the Germans were winning in Ukraine, the calendar was turning. August turned to September. September is turning to October. The precious weeks of dry summer weather have been spent. The Wehrmacht has won a massive battle, but they have not won the war. In the north, the drive on Leningrad has also stalled short of total victory. Instead of storming the city, which Hitler fears will cost too many lives in street fighting, he orders it to be besieged. The Germans sever the last road connection to the city on September 8th. The siege of Leningrad begins a 900-day nightmare of starvation that will claim over 1 million civilian lives, but the city does not fall. It remains a thorn in the German flank. Now, the eyes of the German high command turn back to the center. The Kiev diversion is over. The flanks are secure. The order is given for Operation Typhoon, the final assault on Moscow. The Germans amass nearly 2 million men, 1,000 tanks, and 500 aircraft for this final blow. They believe the Red Army is broken. They believe one last kick will bring the whole structure down before the snow falls. But as the tanks rev their engines for the drive on the capital, the weather begins to change. The autumn rains arrive. The dirt roads of Russia, which have supported the invasion so far, begin to soften. The dust that plagued the soldiers in July transforms into something far worse. Rasputitsa, the time without roads. The mud is coming and waiting ahead of them. Digging desperate defensive lines in the forests around Moscow is a new Soviet commander, a man who has been recalled from the Far East, a man who knows how to use winter as a weapon. Georgy Zhukov. October 1941. Operation Typhoon erupts with the same ferocity that characterized the summer campaigns. Initially, it appears that the skeptics were wrong and Hitler was right. The Wehrmacht smashes through the Soviet defensive lines at Vyazma and Bryansk. Once again, two massive pockets are formed. Once again, over 600,000 Soviet soldiers are killed or captured. The road to Moscow seems stripped of defenders. German tank commanders peer through their binoculars, expecting to see the onion domes of the Kremlin on the horizon. But then, the sky turns gray, and the first drops of rain begin to fall. It starts as a drizzle, then becomes a deluge. Within days, the Russian landscape undergoes a horrifying transformation. This is Rasputitsa. The unpaved roads, churned up by thousands of treads and wheels, dissolve into a sticky, waist-deep quagmire. The Blitzkrieg, a doctrine built on speed and maneuver, grinds to a halt. Supply trucks sink up to their axles and have to be abandoned. Horse-drawn artillery, still the backbone of the German logistics, becomes a nightmare. As horses die of exhaustion trying to pull cannons through the sludge, the fuel consumption of the tanks triples. As engines scream to move mere meters, German generals report that their advance has slowed to less than 5 miles a day, then 2, then 0. The mightiest army in the world is not being stopped by enemy fire, but by the earth itself. Inside Moscow, the situation is precarious. On October 15th, with German spearheads less than 100 miles away, the Soviet government orders the evacuation of the capital. Government ministries, foreign embassies, and the embalmed body of Vladimir Lenin are packed onto trains and sent east to Kuybyshev. Panic grips the city. For 3 days, law and order collapse. Factories go on strike, shops are looted, and desperate civilians try to flee the city. There is a very real sense that the end is near. A train stands waiting at the station for Joseph Stalin. If he leaves, the morale of the defenders will shatter. Stalin paces the platform. Then, he makes his decision. He stays. His presence galvanizes the defense. Under Georgy Zhukov's iron fist, the population of Moscow is mobilized. Women, children, and the elderly are sent out into the freezing rain to dig anti-tank ditches, miles of them. Barricades go up on the main boulevards. The city transforms into a fortress. By mid-November, the temperature drops. The mud freezes solid. The ground becomes hard as concrete. The German commanders breathe a sigh of relief. The tanks can move again. The final launch for Moscow begins. But with the hard ground comes a new enemy, General Winter. The Wehrmacht is totally unprepared, confident of a summer victory. The logistical planners did not send winter clothing. Soldiers are fighting in denim combat tunics in temperatures plunging to -20, then -30 degrees Celsius. The suffering of the German soldier becomes the stuff of nightmares. Sentries freeze to death at their posts. To start tank engines, crews have to light fires under the hulls to thaw the oil. Bolts on machine guns freeze shut. To fire them, soldiers have to urinate on the mechanisms. Frostbite claims more casualties than Soviet bullets. Yet, driven by the desperation of their commanders, they push on. They are so close. By early December, the lead unit of the 2nd Panzer Division reaches the town of Khimki. They are just 18 miles from the Kremlin. A German reconnaissance battalion claims to see the golden spires of the city flashing in the winter sun through their binoculars. They can see the tram stops. They are at the very gates of Moscow. But the German army is a hollow shell. Regiments are reduced to the size of companies. Tanks are running on fumes. The soldiers are gaunt, freezing, and exhausted shadows of the men who crossed the border in June. They have reached the culminating point of victory. They can go no further. And it is exactly at this moment, when the German spring has stretched until it snaps, that the trap is sprung. Unbeknownst to the Germans, a master spy in Tokyo, Richard Sorge, has sent Stalin a piece of intelligence that changes the war. Sorge confirms that Japan will not attack the Soviet Union in the east. They are planning to attack the United States in the Pacific instead. Stalin realizes his eastern border is safe. He orders the transfer of the Siberian divisions. These are not the terrified, ill-equipped conscripts the Germans fought in the summer. These are fresh, hardened troops. They are dressed in thick, quilted winter gear and white camouflage ponchos. They are equipped with the Papasha PPSH-41 submachine gun, which functions perfectly in the cold, and they are supported by T-34 tanks that can traverse the snowdrifts. On December 5, 1941, as the German offensive draws its final, freezing breath, the temperature drops to -34 degrees. General Guderian notes in his diary that the offensive is finished. The next morning, December 6th, a rumble rises from the Soviet lines. It is not the sound of retreat. It is the roar of a massive counteroffensive. 100 divisions, appearing like ghosts out of the blizzard, crash into the exhausted German lines. The hunters have become the hunted. The Wehrmacht, for the first time in World War II, is not just stopped, it is being driven back. The myth of German invincibility is dying in the snows outside Moscow. December 1941. The vast white expanses west of Moscow become a graveyard for the Wehrmacht's ambitions. As Zhukov's Siberian divisions hammer into the flanks of Army Group Center, panic, a sensation previously unknown to the German soldier, begins to spread. The front line is not just bending, it is shattering. German units, frostbitten and starving, abandon their heavy equipment. They leave behind artillery, trucks, and the frozen hulks of their panzers, desperate simply to escape the Soviet steamroller. For a moment, it looks as though the German army will suffer the same fate as Napoleon's Grand Army in 1812. Total disintegration in the snow. General withdrawal orders are drafted. Field marshals beg for permission to retreat to a defensible line hundreds of miles to the west. But in Berlin, Adolf Hitler intervenes. On December 19th, he dismisses the commander-in-chief of the army, Walther von Brauchitsch, and takes personal command of the German army himself. He issues his famous halt order. He commands the troops to stand fast, to yield not a single yard of ground, and to fight to the last man. Dig in, he orders, and if the ground is too frozen to dig, blast craters with howitzers to hide in. Historians still debate this decision. Many argue that by forbidding a retreat, Hitler condemned thousands of men to death by encirclement and freezing. Yet, others argue that this ruthless rigidity prevented a rout. The German line, ragged and pierced in dozens of places, does not collapse, it bends. It breaks into isolated pockets, hedgehogs of resistance. But it holds. The Soviet counteroffensive eventually runs out of steam, as their own supply lines stretch too thin over the snowy wastes. By January 1942, the front stabilizes. The immediate crisis is over, but Operation Barbarossa is dead. The failure of Barbarossa is the pivotal moment of World War II. It represents the transition from a war of rapid maneuver which Germany was designed to win to a war of attrition which Germany was destined to lose. So, why did the greatest invasion in history fail? It was not defeated by the winter alone. To blame the weather is to ignore the fundamental failures of the German plan. Barbarossa was a gamble based on arrogance. German intelligence colossal underestimated the Soviet reserves. They estimated the Red Army had 200 divisions. By August, they had identified 360. They believed the Soviet state was a rotten structure that would collapse at the first kick. Instead, the brutality of the German occupation, the mass executions of civilians, and the treatment of Poles gave the Soviet people no choice but to fight for their survival. Furthermore, logistics doomed the invasion before the first shot was fired. The German supply lines relied on horses and railways with a different gauge than European tracks. As the army moved deeper into Russia, the distance between the supply depots and the front line became a chasm that could not be bridged. Panzers cannot drive without fuel, and men cannot fight without ammunition. The cost of this gamble is staggering. By the end of 1941, the Wehrmacht has suffered over 830,000 casualties, nearly a quarter of its total strength. They have lost over 2,700 tanks and 40,000 horses. The elite core of the German army, the veterans of Poland and France, lies buried in the Russian earth. On the Soviet side, the losses are apocalyptic. Between June and December 1941, the Red Army loses over 4 million men killed, wounded, or captured. It is a scale of slaughter that the human mind struggles to comprehend. But the Soviet Union still stands. Crucially, while the panzers were stalling outside Moscow, the Soviets achieved a miracle of industry. They dismantled over 1,500 factories in the West, loaded them onto trains, and shipped them east beyond the Ural Mountains, out of range of German bombers. There, in the freezing wilderness, workers, often women and children, rebuilt the factories and began churning out T-30 for tanks and aircraft in numbers Germany could never hope to match. The strategic nightmare that Germany feared has come true. On December 7, 1941, just as the German offensive in Russia is dying, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. 4 days later, Hitler declares war on the United States. Germany now faces a world war against the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the industrial might of America simultaneously. Operation Barbarossa was meant to secure a 1,000-year Reich. Instead, it opened the gates to a calamity that would destroy it. The war in the East will rage on for 3.5 more years. It will see the horrors of Stalingrad, the tank battles of Kursk, and the fall of Berlin. But the outcome was decided here. In the vast, unforgiving spaces of 1941, the Wehrmacht marched into the East believing they were the masters of war. They learned, too late, the old Russian proverb, Russia is not a country, it is a world. And in the winter of 1941, that world swallowed them whole.